She walked into that church in a second-hand dress, and before she even reached the altar, the laughter started. Not whispers. Laughter. Vivian Harcourt stood in the third pew, gloved hand raised to her perfect mouth, and said, loud enough for every soul in that chapel to hear, "My God, he actually brought the cook!" The room went cold. Then it rippled. Snickers spread from pew to pew like a brush fire nobody wanted to stop. Eleanor Ashcroft kept walking. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves, but her chin didn't drop an inch. And then Gideon Blackridge, cattle baron, Iron Ridge legend, the most feared and respected man in 3 counties, turned from the altar, looked straight at Vivian, and opened his mouth. What he said next silenced every single person in that room. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because every week I bring you stories just like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Get Part 1. The Woman. No one believed in Wyoming Territory, January 1880. The cold that January was the kind that got inside your bones and reminded you it was still there 3 days later. Eleanor Ashcroft had lived through 11 Wyoming winters, and she still wasn't used to them. She didn't think a person was supposed to get used to something like that. You just survived it, season after season, and counted it as a small victory that you were still standing when spring finally decided to show up. She was 34 years old. She lived alone in a 2-room cabin on the western edge of Caldwell Flats, a settlement that was generous enough to call itself a town, but not generous enough to offer much to a woman living by herself, with no husband, no family within 400 miles, and a body that had never once matched what people around here considered acceptable. Eleanor was a big woman. She'd been big since she was 12 years old, and she had stopped waiting for that to change sometime around her 25th birthday. What she had instead of a small waist and fashionable silhouette was a pair of strong hands, a memory sharp enough to recall every spice ratio she'd ever worked with, and a stubbornness that her late mother had called a character flaw and that Eleanor had quietly reclassified as a survival skill. She made her living baking, pies mostly, bread when the flour supply held, sometimes a proper roast for the Hendersons 2 miles out, who were elderly and kind and never once commented on her size. She charged fair prices and delivered what she promised, and if that wasn't enough to earn her a place in Caldwell Flats society, well, she'd stopped expecting that too. The morning that changed everything started like most mornings that winter. She was up before 5, feeding the small iron stove in her kitchen corner when she heard boots on her porch steps. Heavy boots. Deliberate. She reached for the iron skillet before she reached for the door handle. That was just sense. Miss Ashcroft. The man on her porch was tall, taller than the door frame required him to duck slightly, which he did without thinking, the way a man does when he's been tall his whole life. He had a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather for about 20 years on purpose. Dark eyes, deep set, a jaw that could have been cut from the same limestone that ran through the ridge country north of town. She knew who he was. Everyone in 3 counties knew who Gideon Blackridge was. Mr. Blackridge. She didn't lower the skillet. Not immediately. His eyes dropped to it, then came back up to her face. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something between the two. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. "People who aren't here for trouble don't generally show up at 5 in the morning." "Fair point." He pulled his hat off, held it against his chest. "I'm here because I need a cook. My last one quit 3 days ago. Took the wagon horse with him when he went, which is a separate problem, but the cook situation is the immediate one." Eleanor stared at him. "You have 20 men on that ranch." 22 as of last week. "And you came to me." "I came to you because Margaret Henderson told me you were the best cook in this territory and probably the next 2 over." He paused. "She also told me you needed the work." Eleanor felt the heat climb up the back of her neck. She didn't know whether to be grateful to Margaret Henderson or furious with her. She settled on a complicated mixture of both. "What does it pay?" she asked. He named a figure. She almost dropped the skillet, not from weakness, from shock. "That's twice what a ranch cook earns," she said. The last one quit after 11 days. The one before that lasted 6. He looked at her steadily. I'm not paying for a cook. I'm paying for someone who'll actually stay. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The stove was popping behind her. Outside, the wind was starting up again, that low moan it made when it came down from the northern ridge and meant business. Your men, she said. They know you're here. No. They're going to have opinions. Something shifted in his jaw. My men's opinions about who cooks their food don't factor into my hiring decisions. That's easy to say from where you're standing. I know it is. He didn't flinch from that. She noticed. Miss Ashcroft, I'm asking you to come do a job. I'm not asking you to care what they think. And if they make it impossible? Then I'll deal with that. She studied him. He stood there and let her study him, which was something. Most men got uncomfortable when she looked at them too directly, too long. Gideon Blackridge just stood there like a man who didn't mind being seen. I'll need my own quarters, she said. Not in the bunkhouse. Storage room off the kitchen. It's small, but it locks. I'll need full authority over the kitchen and the supply ordering. Done. And if a man puts his hands on me or my equipment without permission, I need your word that it gets handled, not ignored. Handled. Something came into his eyes that she couldn't quite name. It looked almost like relief. You have my word, he said. Eleanor set the skillet down on the counter. I'll need 2 days to close up my cabin and pack what I need. I'll send a wagon tomorrow afternoon. She nodded once. He put his hat back on, turned to go, and then stopped. Miss Ashcroft. What? The men are going to have opinions, he said. You were right about that. I just want you to know that I'm aware of it, and I'm sorry in advance for the ones I can't predict. She looked at him for one more moment. Mr. Blackridge, I've been living in this town for 11 years. I don't need you to apologize for things people haven't said yet. I've already heard every version of it. He nodded and left. Eleanor stood in her kitchen for a full minute after she heard his horse move off, and then she sat down hard in the wooden chair by the stove and pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed. 22 men. She'd be cooking for 22 men who hadn't asked for her, hadn't wanted her, and were going to take one look at her and start their timers on how many days until she broke. She thought about saying no. She thought about it seriously, the way a person thinks about a door that they know leads somewhere dangerous but might also be the only door in the building. Then she thought about the frost patterns on her window that morning, and the way her flower supply was running low, and the way Caldwell Flats looked at her when she walked to the general store. And she thought, no. No, she'd been disappearing by staying still. Maybe disappearing by moving was worth the gamble. She started making a list. Gab. The wagon arrived this next afternoon driven by a young ranch hand named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 17 and who clearly had not been told who he was picking up. He pulled up to her cabin, saw Eleanor carrying a crate of spice tins, and for a split second his face did the thing faces did. That rapid recalculation, that flash of surprise followed by the effort to hide it. She watched him do it. She'd had a lot of practice watching people do it. Here. She handed him the crate. Don't tip it. There's glass in there. Yes, ma'am. He took it carefully and didn't say another word until they were 10 minutes down the road, at which point he apparently decided to be decent, because he said, You ever cooked for a big crew before? I've cooked for myself for 11 years, she said. Turns out if you can do that without going miserable, you can scale. He thought about that. The guys are... He stopped. Curious? She offered. Something like that. What are they saying? He kept his eyes on the road. The horse's breath was coming in white puffs in the afternoon cold. Some of them are saying Mr. Blackridge has lost his mind, Cody said quietly. Some of them are saying worse. What are you saying? He glanced at her sideways. I'm saying you showed up, ma'am. That's more than the last two did before they even started. It was a small thing, but Eleanor filed it away carefully, the way she filed everything. The things that might matter later, the things that told you who a person actually was when they thought nobody important was watching. Iron Ridge Ranch sat at the foot of the eastern ridge, sheltered enough from the worst of the northern wind to be livable in winter, open enough to the south to get decent sun in summer. The main house was big and square and built like it meant to last, which Eleanor respected. The bunkhouse was a long, low building to the east. The kitchen was attached to the main house by a covered walkway. Its own room, large, with a serious iron range and enough counter space that Eleanor immediately felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She was examining the pantry when they found her. There were 4 of them initially. They came through the kitchen door without knocking, and they stood there looking at her the way men looked at something that had shown up in the wrong place. The one in front was broad, blonde, and had the permanent squint of a man who'd spent years looking into the sun. His name, she'd learned, was Harlan Briggs, senior hand, 14 years on the ranch, and the unofficial opinion setter for every man in that bunkhouse. "Huh," Harlan said. Eleanor didn't look up from the inventory she was mentally running. "Kitchen's not open for visitors." "We ain't visitors. We eat here. You eat here at meal times." She straightened, turned, looked at him squarely. "You don't come through that door outside of meal times unless there's blood or fire, and even then, you knock." The man behind Harlan, shorter, dark-haired, a scar along his jawline, made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That right?" "That's right." Harlan looked at her for a long moment with that squinting assessment. "Blackridge hired you, did he?" "He did." "Huh." He said it again, the same way, like it was a full sentence. Then, "Last cook was a man named Peters. You know what happened to Peters?" "I don't." "Left in the middle of the night. Didn't even take his good boots, just went." He paused, letting that land. "Before him was a woman named Clara. She lasted 6 days. Cried the whole last 2. He tilted his head slightly. "I'm just telling you the history." Eleanor looked at him. She had a ladle in her hand. She'd picked it up from the counter without quite deciding to, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a tool that might need to be used. "What's your name?" she asked. "Harlan Briggs." "Mr. Briggs." She held his gaze without blinking. "I'm not Peters, I'm not Clara, and I'm not leaving in the middle of the night." She paused. "Now, unless you want to help me figure out why this pantry hasn't been properly rotated since October, I'm going to need you to get out of my kitchen." Harlan stared at her. The dark-haired man behind him made the sound again, and this time it was definitely a laugh. He caught himself, turned it into a cough. Harlan turned around slowly and walked out. The others followed. Eleanor let out a breath through her nose. Quiet, controlled. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the middle of that conversation. She wasn't sure exactly when. She spent the rest of the afternoon taking stock. The pantry was in worse shape than she'd thought. Not neglected exactly, just managed by a series of people who had other priorities. There was good smoked pork, some of it, though some had turned. Beans in quantity, dried corn, reasonable flour, lard. Coffee that had been sitting in an open tin and had gone stale at the edges. She made notes. When Gideon came to check on her around 5, she handed him the list without preamble. He looked at it. "This is a lot." The coffee tin wasn't sealed, 2 pounds wasted. The pork in the far left, throw it out, don't try to use it. I need dried apple, if there's any to be found in town, and a new stock of salt because whoever was managing the supply used it like it was going to run out of fashion. He was quiet for a moment. "Briggs came and talked to you." "He did." "What did he say?" "He told me the history of the position." She looked up at him. "I told him to leave my kitchen." Something happened at the corner of Gideon's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like a muscle relaxing that had been held tight for a long time. "How'd that go?" "He left," she said. "So, we'll see." "Eleanor." He said her name like he'd been thinking about whether to use it. "You don't have to prove anything to these men. You just have to cook." She looked at him steadily. "With respect, Mr. Blackridge, that's not how it works when you're me." He held her gaze. Something in his face went quiet. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose it isn't." He took the list and went to deal with it, and Eleanor turned back to her kitchen and started the first supper she would cook at Iron Ridge Ranch. A thick bean stew with the good smoked pork, cornbread with the last of the usable flour, and coffee made fresh, sealed properly, the way it was supposed to be done. She made enough for 24 in case anyone came back twice. Most of them did. Nobody said thank you, not that first night. But nobody said anything else either. and the pot came back empty, and that was its own kind of answer. Eleanor washed the dishes alone in the lamplight, her feet aching, her back tight, and somewhere in the territory a wolf howling at the frozen dark outside. And she thought, one night. You made it one night. She hung up her apron, went to her small locked room off the kitchen, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She felt like she was, against all reasonable odds, exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, Harlan Briggs showed up at the kitchen door at 5:45. He knocked. Once. Hard. She opened it. He stood there with his hat in his hand, which was not what she'd expected. "My back left tooth's been bad for a month," he said. "Can't chew hard bread." She looked at him. "Soft biscuits," she said. "I can do that." He nodded, put his hat back on, walked away. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, cold air spilling in around her, and thought about that. 22 men, she thought, 22 stories. She went back to her stove and started the biscuits, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she began paying attention to everything. The soft biscuits were gone before breakfast was half over. Harlan Briggs ate 3 of them without a word, and Eleanor noticed the way his jaw worked differently on the left side than the right, favoring the good teeth, and she filed that away next to everything else she was collecting about these men. The small physical facts that told a larger story if you paid attention long enough. She was paying attention to everything. That was the only strategy she had, and she knew it. She couldn't outmuscle a bunkhouse full of ranch hands. She couldn't charm them. She'd never been particularly charming, and starting now would only read as desperation. What she could do was watch and remember, and cook like her life depended on it, which, in a practical sense, it did. By the end of the first week, she had a mental ledger on every man at Iron Ridge. Harlan Briggs, bad back tooth, left side. Ate slower than the others. Drank his coffee with 2 sugars but would never ask for the second one directly, just held out his cup and waited. 14 years on the ranch, which meant he remembered what Iron Ridge looked like before Gideon turned it into something worth talking about, and that history sat on him like a second coat. Cody, the young one who'd driven her wagon, 17 years old, grew up in Missouri, missed his mother's cooking in that specific way young men do when they haven't yet learned to say it out loud. He kept gravitating toward the kitchen after supper, not for food, just to be near the warmth and the smell of it. Eleanor let him stay. She didn't make conversation about it. She just let him be there. A man named Dutch, real name nobody seemed to remember or use, who had a left hand that curled in at the fingers from an old rope burn. He couldn't grip a full mug comfortably. Eleanor started putting his coffee in a shorter, wider cup without explanation. He noticed on the 3rd day and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she just turned back to the stove because making a moment out of it would have embarrassed him. There was a hand named Reuben who had the look of a man who hadn't slept properly in months, the bruise-colored shadows under his eyes, and the way he flinched at loud sounds. She didn't know the story and didn't ask. She started putting extra bread in his portion. Dense, good bread, the kind that sits in your stomach and tells your nervous system to quiet down. It wasn't a cure, but it was something. And then there was Harlan's shadow, a man named Cole Decker, who had made it his personal project from day 2 to make Eleanor's life uncomfortable. Cole was 26, lean and sharp-faced, with the kind of humor that had a hook in it. He'd grown up in a family where cruelty passed for entertainment, which Eleanor recognized because she'd met that type before, and they all had the same quality. They needed an audience. Take away the audience and they deflated, at least temporarily. "You know what the difference is between your biscuits and a river rock?" Cole announced at breakfast on the 4th morning, loud enough for the whole table. Eleanor was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "The rock wouldn't give me heartburn," Cole continued. A few men laughed. Not all of them, she noted. Some of them just kept eating. "Funny," said Cody quietly, in a tone that meant it wasn't. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "Are you?" That was Dutch, not looking up from his food. "Because I'm thinking these are the best biscuits I've had on this ranch in about 3 years, so I don't know what you're thinking about, Cole, but it ain't the biscuits." The table went a little quiet. Cole's smile thinned. He looked at Dutch, then at Eleanor's back, then back at his plate. He ate the rest of his breakfast without saying anything, which was its own small victory, though Eleanor knew better than to count it as settled. She turned around when most of them had gone, carrying the empty pot to the wash basin, and found Cody still at the table. "You don't have to do that," she said, not sharply, just as fact. "Cole's a bully," Cody said. "My daddy used to say the only thing a bully respects is someone who won't sit down." "Your daddy wasn't wrong," Eleanor set the pot in the water. "But it's not your fight." "Maybe it is, a little," he said. "Maybe we all live here, and we all got to eat here, and maybe that makes it everybody's business a little." She looked at him over her shoulder. 17 years old, and already figuring out something that took most men 40 years to arrive at, if they got there at all. "Go muck out the stalls," she said. "You're going to be late." He went. But she could tell by the way he walked that he felt good about the conversation, and she let herself feel good about it too, quietly, where nobody could see. That afternoon, she baked a molasses cake. She hadn't planned to. She'd been thinking about the supply list, about the dried apple that had finally arrived, about the fact that the range was pulling slightly hot on the right side and she needed to compensate. And then somehow she was making molasses cake because something in the morning had shifted and she wanted to mark it in some way, even if only she knew what she was marking. She put it on the table at supper without comment. Nobody said anything for about 30 seconds. Then Reuben, quiet, sleepless Reuben, with the shadows under his eyes, reached out and took a piece, and the sound he made when he ate it was the sound of a man who'd forgotten for a moment that things were hard. Cole Decker didn't take any. He watched the others take it, and he didn't reach for it, and Eleanor pretended not to notice either way. Gideon came in late that evening, which was becoming a pattern. He worked longer hours than any of his men and ate whatever was left at whatever time he finally came through the kitchen door. She'd started keeping a covered plate for him without being asked. "You made cake," he said, finding the last two pieces on the cloth. "Molasses." "Yes." He sat down at the kitchen table rather than taking his plate to eat alone in the main house the way he usually did, and Eleanor realized she didn't mind. The kitchen was her territory, but he'd never felt like an intrusion in it. He sat the way a man sits in a place he respects, carefully, like he was aware of taking up space. "Cole giving you trouble?" he asked. She paused in her washing. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me anything. I see how he sits at the table, how he positions himself." He forked a piece of cake. "Cole Decker has been on this ranch for 4 years, and in those 4 years I have watched him chase off 2 horses and 1 border collie that didn't belong to him. He's a particular kind of problem." "He's a bully," Eleanor said, using Cody's word. "And bullies have a logic to them. You just have to understand the logic." Gideon looked at her. "What's his logic?" "He needs to be the most interesting thing in the room." She kept washing. "Right now he thinks I'm a threat to that. He'll stop when he finds something else to be interesting about." She paused. "Or when the other men stop watching him do it. Whichever comes first." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this more than I have." "I've had more practice thinking about it." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised her, a little. She'd gotten used to silences that prickled, silences that were waiting for her to say the wrong thing. This one just sat there like weather that wasn't doing anything yet. "The cake is exceptional," he said finally. She snorted, an actual snort, not a ladylike sound, and she heard it come out of her and was briefly mortified and then decided not to be. "It's molasses cake, Mr. Blackridge. It's not exceptional. It's just made correctly." "In my experience," he said, "made correctly is rarer than exceptional." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at his plate, not at her, and she couldn't tell if that was deliberate or just how he was, and she decided not to think about it and turned back to her washing. The next 2 weeks were not peaceful, exactly. Peace wasn't really available at Iron Ridge Ranch, but they were manageable. She found her rhythm in the kitchen, the particular choreography of feeding 22 men 3 times a day, and she began to learn it the way you learn a dance, not by counting steps, but by feeling where the weight wants to go. She learned that Harlan ate better on the days his back was hurting, which seemed backward until she realized that food was the one comfort he allowed himself when the pain was bad. She started putting a little more on his plate on those days without comment. He never acknowledged it. She didn't expect him to. She learned that Reuben's sleeplessness got worse on nights when the wind was loud from the north, and that on those mornings he needed something warm and plain, not the spiced things, not the rich things, just good plain porridge and quiet. She gave him that. She learned that 3 of the men, brothers, it turned out, from New Mexico, named Alvarez, kept a small tin of dried chiles in their gear that they'd been putting on their food in secret because they hadn't wanted to ask the previous cook for something different and start an argument. She found out when she came into the dining room early one morning and caught the middle brother, Marco, sprinkling them onto his eggs with the guilty speed of a man doing something he knows he's not supposed to. He froze when he saw her. "What kind are those?" she asked. He blinked. Ancho, and some guajillo." She put out her hand. He handed her the tin, slowly, like he thought she was going to confiscate it. She shook a small amount into her palm, smelled it, touched the tip of her tongue to it. "I need more of these," she said. "Will your people in New Mexico send them if you write?" Marco stared at her. You'd use them? In the cooking?" "I've been doing this whole territory a disservice with the amount of flavor I'm not putting in the food," she said. "Write to your people. I'll pay the shipping." He wrote the letter that same day. The chiles arrived 3 weeks later, and the morning she used them. A slow-cooked beef with ancho and dried corn, the kind of thing that made the whole building smell different from 6 in the morning on. There was a different quality to the silence at breakfast. Less hostile. More like the silence of people who are concentrating on something that deserves it. Marco's oldest brother, Tomas, looked up at some point and said, "My grandmother made something like this," in a voice that was so unguarded it seemed to surprise even him. "I know," Eleanor said from the kitchen doorway. "That's what I was going for." She didn't explain how she knew. She didn't need to. Marco had talked about his grandmother's cooking once, in passing, while she was nearby. She'd remembered. That was all. But the way Tomas looked at her after that was different from how he'd looked at her before, and she cataloged that too. The problem with Cole Decker resolved itself, as she'd suspected it would, though not in the way she'd expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after her arrival. She was in the kitchen running through the bread for the next morning when she heard raised voices from behind the bunkhouse. Not fighting voices exactly, more like the tight, controlled anger of men who were arguing about something that mattered. She wasn't going to involve herself. The bunkhouse was not her territory, and she knew better than to cross those lines without cause. Then she heard Cody's voice, high and strained. She was around the corner of the building before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Cole had Cody backed against the bunkhouse wall. Nothing physical. Not yet. But the posture was the posture of a man who was making a boy feel like the walls were closing in. 2 other hands stood nearby, watching with the particular stillness of people who weren't going to stop it, but weren't going to cheer either. "I'm just asking a question," Cole was saying, his voice smooth and amused. "Real simple question. You gonna answer it?" "I already answered it," Cody said. His voice was steady, but his jaw was locked. "You answered wrong." "Cole?" Eleanor's voice was flat. Not loud, just flat. Cole turned. "Kitchen needs wood," she said. "Stacking's low. I need 2 armloads before supper." Cole stared at her. "I know you're not the kitchen boy," she said. "I'm not asking you as the kitchen boy. I'm asking you as a favor. You can say no." She held his gaze. "But I'd appreciate it." He looked at her for a long moment. The smooth amusement was gone from his face, and something else was there, something she recognized. The specific confusion of a person who had been handled without being fought, which was the most disorienting thing you could do to a bully, and she knew it. He pushed off from the bunkhouse wall, walked past her toward the woodpile without saying anything. Cody exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," he said, which was what he'd said to her the first time, a week ago. "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to." She went back to the kitchen. Cole brought the wood 20 minutes later, dumped it in 2 armloads by the stove, and left without speaking. That evening at supper, he was quieter than usual. The next morning, he asked her gruffly if there was any more of that bean stew from 2 days ago. "I'll make it Friday," she said. He nodded and sat down, and that was, more or less, the end of Cole Decker as a sustained problem. He never became friendly. He wasn't built for friendly. But he stopped being her opponent, and in a place like Iron Ridge, that counted for a great deal. The blizzard came on a Tuesday in late February. It came the way the worst storms came, faster than the clouds had suggested it would, and meaner. By noon, the visibility was down to 20 feet and dropping. The men had pulled back from the outer pasture early, which was the right call, and Eleanor was in her kitchen boiling a stock that would keep through whatever the next 3 days looked like when she heard the shouting. It was Harlan's voice. Harlan, who never shouted. She was through the kitchen door before the stock had finished settling. The men were standing in a cluster near the bunkhouse, all of them looking north, into the white. Gideon was there, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do. It was scared, which on Gideon Blackridge looked strange and terrible, like seeing something structural give way. Cody went out to check the fence line at the north pasture, Harlan said, turning to see her. That was 2 hours ago. 2 hours, Gideon said flatly. I just found out. He didn't say he was going that far, Marco said. He just said the fence. The north pasture fence was 3/4 of a mile from the main building. In this visibility, in this cold, with the wind doing what it was doing, 3/4 of a mile was a very long way. Which direction would he have gone from the main gate? Eleanor asked. Harlan looked at her. Northeast, along the ridgeline. She went back inside. She had her coat and her wool blanket off the bed before anyone else had finished talking, and she was through the door before Gideon caught up with her. Eleanor, his voice was sharp, you cannot go out there. I know the ridgeline northeast, she said. I walked it last week. There's a rock outcrop about 600 yards out. If he's sheltering, that's where he'll be. You walked it last week in fair weather. It's also where he'd go because it's the only landmark visible from the fence line when the visibility drops. She pulled her coat tighter. I know how 17-year-olds think in a panic. They find the thing they remember and they go to it. Gideon grabbed her arm, not rough, but firm. If you don't come back, Gotseti, then send Dutch in 20 minutes, she said. Northeast, 600 yards, the rock outcrop. I'll leave marks in the snow when I can. She went. The wind was brutal and personal. It came at her from different angles like it was looking for a seam to get through. She kept her head down and counted steps, which was the only way to track distance when you couldn't see horizon. She'd memorized the terrain last week with the specific instinct of a woman who'd spent 11 years knowing she might have to get herself somewhere unpleasant alone, and that memory served her now. She found him at 580 steps, which was close enough to her estimate that she'd have felt satisfied about it if she hadn't been so cold. Cody was behind the outcrop, knees drawn up, his hat pulled down as far as it would go. He was conscious, but not entirely with her when she grabbed his arm. His eyes were open, but the look in them was the blank look of a person whose body had started making decisions without consulting the rest of them. Up, she said. Her voice was loud because the wind was loud. Cody, I need you to stand up. Miss Eleanor. His voice was thick. Stand up. I'm not carrying you, and we both know it. She hauled on his arm with both hands, and he got his legs under him in that clumsy way of someone whose body was mostly working on memory. There you go, hold my arm. Don't let go. They went back 300 steps before Gideon materialized out of the white, because of course he hadn't waited 20 minutes, and together they got Cody back to the main house and in front of the kitchen stove and into the warmth, and Eleanor made him drink broth that she'd kept hot, and she rubbed his hands between hers until the feeling came back, and he made the face people make when circulation returns to cold extremities, pained and miserable and alive. You could have died, Gideon said, standing in her kitchen doorway, looking at her. His voice was even, which meant he was controlling it. He could have died, she said. I just went and got him. Eleanor. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the quiet assessment she'd gotten used to, not the careful respect. Something more exposed than that. Something that needed a name she wasn't ready to give it. Don't, she said quietly. Not unkindly. He nodded, stepped back. The broth smells good. It's just stock, she said. Made correctly. He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move and then settle. After Cody was bundled into a bunk and the blizzard had made clear it was going to do what it was going to do for as long as it wanted, Eleanor went back to her kitchen and stood alone in it and let her hand shake. They'd been steady the whole time she was out there. Steady through getting Cody up and steering him back and getting the broth on and managing the next 3 hours. And now they shook like they'd been saving it all up. She put both palms flat on the counter and breathed. She thought about Caldwell Flats, about the way the town looked at her when she walked to the general store, about the weight of 11 years of being the woman nobody believed in, nobody chose, nobody thought could manage the hard things. Then she thought about Cody's hands warming in hers, and Dutch's cup, and Marco writing to his grandmother's people for chiles, and Harlan's expression when the soft biscuits appeared, that particular expression of a man who hadn't expected to be thought of and didn't know what to do with it. Her hands stopped shaking. She went back to the stove and finished the stock, and she thought, this is what I'm here for, not just the cooking, this. 3 mornings after the blizzard broke, Harlan Briggs came to the kitchen door at 5:45 as he always did. He knocked once, as he always did. She opened it. He stood there with his hat in his hand. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him working up to something. Harlan was not a man built for words that cost him anything, and whatever he was about to say was going to cost him. What you did for the kid, he said, going out in that. It was fine, she said. It wasn't fine, it was... He stopped, tried again. Men out here don't talk about things like that. I know. But I wanted you to know that the men... Another stop. He pressed his mouth together, looked somewhere past her left shoulder. We see you, Miss Ashcroft, is what I'm saying. Eleanor looked at him. Big, weathered Harlan Briggs, 14 years on this ranch, who came to her door every morning and held his hat and never asked for things directly. I appreciate that, Mr. Briggs, she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, turned to go. Mr. Briggs, he stopped. I've been reading about tooth pain, she said. There's a thing with clove oil that's supposed to help. I have some, if you want to try it. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. His shoulders did something, a small, complicated movement. Yeah, he said. All right. Come back after supper. He walked away toward the barn, and Eleanor let the door close, and she stood in her kitchen and felt the particular warmth of a place that was, however tentatively, however imperfectly, becoming hers. None of this had been easy. She wasn't going to tell herself it had been. There had been nights in her small locked room when she'd lain awake running through the arguments for leaving, the practicality of it, the simple math of pain avoided, and only her own stubbornness and a bone-deep dislike of letting anyone win by attrition had kept her from packing her crate of spice tins and finding Cody to drive her home. But home was a cabin with frost on the windows and flour running low, and here was a kitchen that smelled like ancho and molasses and the good clean smell of wood smoke. And outside that kitchen were 22 men who were, one by one and in their own time, beginning to see her. Not a category, not a problem, not a punchline, just Eleanor. The hard weeks that came after the blizzard were when Gideon started finding reasons to come to the kitchen at times that weren't strictly supper. Sometimes it was practical, supply questions, a hand's injury she should know about, whether she needed anything from the next supply run. But sometimes it was just the sound of him at the kitchen door, and she'd say, "Come in," and he'd sit at the table with his coffee, and she'd keep working, and they'd talk about nothing important and everything. He told her about Iron Ridge before he'd built it up, a 40-acre plot, and 15 cattle, and a winter so bad he'd had to burn the furniture to stay warm. She told him about her first winter alone in Caldwell Flats, which had not been much better. He told her about his father, briefly and without sentimentality, the way people talk about hard things when they've processed them enough to carry them lightly. She did not tell him about her mother, not yet, but she thought about it. She noticed the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking at him. She noticed because she was Eleanor Ashcroft, and she noticed everything, and she had noticed it from the 3rd or 4th kitchen visit. That quality of attention, careful and warm, and somehow both steady and searching. She didn't name it, not yet. Naming things too early was how you broke them. But she thought about the fact that in 34 years, no one had ever looked at her that particular way, and she thought about it in her small room at night, carefully, the way you think about something fragile that you're not yet sure you have the right to want. Outside, the Wyoming winter was starting, just barely, to soften at the edges. Not spring yet. Spring was still weeks out, but there was a quality to the afternoon light that was different from January, and the men had started leaving their heaviest coats inside some days. And Eleanor's kitchen had settled into itself the way a good kitchen does, warm and known, and used the way it was meant to be used. It had taken 7 weeks. It had felt like 7 years, and also like 7 days, depending on the moment. She was not the same woman who had come here in January with a crate of spice tins and a skillet she'd reached for before she'd opened the door. She was still herself. She would always be herself. She'd been herself too long to stop now. But she was herself in a place that had begun to hold her, quietly and without fanfare, the way a good place does when you've earned your way into it. The letter arrived on a Thursday in March. It came with the supply wagon, tucked among the orders, addressed in a handwriting that was formal and careful and designed to look important. Eleanor didn't see it arrive. She was in the kitchen. She didn't even know about it until that evening, when she came through the covered walkway to bring Gideon his covered plate, and found him at his desk with the letter in his hand and a look on his face that made something in her stomach drop. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up, set the letter down, and the expression on his face, not scared, not the way he'd been scared in the blizzard. Something more complicated than that. Something like a man who has been doing well and just heard a familiar footstep on the porch. "An old acquaintance," he said carefully. "She's coming to Caldwell Flats." "She," Eleanor said. "Her name is Vivian Harcourt." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water, and even though Eleanor had never heard it before, the way he said it told her everything she needed to know about the size of the ripple it was going to make. Vivian Harcourt arrived in Caldwell Flats on a Friday, which Eleanor would later think was fitting because nothing good ever arrived on a Friday without something else arriving right behind it. She came by private coach, not the stage, not a rented wagon, a private coach with a driver, and a second man riding behind with luggage, which was the kind of entrance that announced itself before you even saw the person inside. Eleanor heard about it from Cody, who'd been in town for supplies and came back with the flour and the dried apple, and a look on his face like a man who'd witnessed something he wasn't sure how to categorize. "She's something," Cody said, setting the crates down in the kitchen. He said it the way people say something when they mean the opposite of a compliment. "What does she look like?" Eleanor asked, and hated that she'd asked it. "Tall, dark hair, dressed like she's going to a party in Denver, not Caldwell Flats." He paused. "She was asking about the ranch, at the general store, in front of everyone." Eleanor kept her hands moving. She was breaking down a cut of beef, and the work was good for keeping her voice level. Asking what? Whether it was true that Blackridge had hired a... He stopped. "Say it." "A woman from town." She said it different than that. Eleanor set down the knife. "Cody." He looked at the floor. She said, "The fat woman from the flats." And then she laughed, and some people laughed with her. He looked up. Not everyone. Mrs. Henderson didn't laugh, but some people did. Eleanor picked the knife back up. She didn't say anything for a moment, and the silence in the kitchen was the specific kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of a person holding themselves together from the inside. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You're not going to..." "I'm going to finish this roast," she said, "and you're going to go clean up before supper." He went. She finished the roast, and while she worked, she thought about Vivian Harcourt and what it meant that a woman who had never met her was already talking about her by her size in the middle of a general store on a Friday afternoon. Gideon told her the rest of it that evening. He came to the kitchen while she was washing up, and he sat down at his usual spot at the table, and he didn't reach for the coffee she'd left out, which was how she knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. "Vivian and I were engaged," he said, 3 years ago. Eleanor kept washing. "It ended because she wanted me to sell Iron Ridge and move to Denver. Her family had a house there, connections, a whole life arranged. I said no." He paused. "She said yes to someone else inside of 6 months. He died last winter, mining accident." "And now she's back," Eleanor said. "And now she's back." He looked at his hands on the table. "She wrote to me before she came. Said she wanted to talk about the past. I wrote back and said there wasn't much to talk about. Another pause. Apparently, she disagrees. Eleanor turned from the wash basin and looked at him. In 2 months of working here, she had gotten good at reading Gideon Blackridge's face, which was not an easy face to read because he kept most things behind it deliberately. But there were tells. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes went still when he was choosing his words carefully. Right now, he looked like a man bracing for a storm he'd already been through once and hadn't enjoyed the first time. "What is it you're trying to tell me?" Eleanor asked. Not unkindly, just directly, the way she'd learned to be direct with him because he responded to it better than anything else. "I'm telling you because I should have told you before she arrived," he said. "And I'm telling you because—" He stopped. Tried again. "Because what I said to her in that letter was true. There isn't anything to talk about with Vivian Harcourt. Not anymore. And I wanted you to know that before she started telling you otherwise." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The thing she was feeling was complicated and she didn't trust herself to name it cleanly, so she said the practical thing, which was, "She already talked to people in town." His jaw tightened. "I heard." "She knows who I am, or her version of who I am." Eleanor picked up the drying cloth. "She's going to come here." "Probably. And when she does, she's going to try to make me feel like I don't belong here." He looked at her steadily. "Eleanor, you belong here more than anyone who's walked through that door in years." She looked back at him. Those words landed somewhere in her chest and sat there, warm and slightly terrifying. "That's kind of you," she said. "It still doesn't change what she's going to do." Vivian came to Iron Ridge the following Tuesday. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't send word ahead. She simply arrived at mid-morning when she presumably knew Gideon would be out on the range and Eleanor would be alone in the kitchen. Eleanor heard the horse and came to the kitchen door and stood in it, drying her hands on her apron, watching Vivian Harcourt dismount with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her whole life being watched and had decided to be excellent at it. She was, Eleanor had to admit, striking. The kind of striking that came from money and time and knowing exactly how to use both. Her coat was a deep blue wool that cost more than Eleanor made in 2 months. Her face was arranged in an expression that managed to be both pleasant and dismissive at the same time, which was an achievement. She walked up to the kitchen door and stopped a deliberate 2 steps below Eleanor. "You must be the cook," she said, as if there were several options. "I am," Eleanor said. "I'm Vivian Harcourt. I'm an old friend of Gideon's." "I know who you are." Eleanor didn't move from the doorway. Something shifted in Vivian's expression, a small recalibration, like a woman adjusting her aim. "May I come in?" "Kitchen's not open for visitors," Eleanor said. She heard Harlan's voice in her own memory as she said it, and the slight irony of that helped her keep her face neutral. Vivian's pleasant expression didn't waver, but something behind it did. "I just want to talk." "About what?" "About Gideon." A pause. "About what's best for him." "I imagine Gideon has thoughts about what's best for him," Eleanor said. "You might try asking him directly." "You're not what I expected," Vivian said. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're deciding to shift tactics. "People in town said you were meek, easily frightened." "People in town don't know me well." "No." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "I can see that." Another pause, and then the pleasantness dropped, just slightly, just enough to let the thing underneath show. "He'll get tired of this. Playing rancher's wife without the ring. He's done it before. He has a weakness for—" She paused, choosing the word slowly. "Strays." Eleanor felt it land. She let it land because flinching would have been the thing Vivian was looking for. "Good morning, Miss Harcourt," Eleanor said, and she closed the kitchen door. She stood with her back against it for a count of 10. Then she went back to her stove. Whatever was coming, it had just started. It started with the rumors first because that was how someone like Vivian worked, carefully, at a remove, so that nothing could be directly traced back to her gloved hands. Within a week of her arrival in Caldwell Flats, the stories had begun to circulate. That Eleanor had a drinking problem she was hiding from the ranch. That she had a husband somewhere who was looking for her. that the food at Iron Ridge had made two men sick, that Gideon Blackridge's good sense had finally left him and everyone who cared about him was worried. Eleanor heard pieces of it from Cody, who heard it in town. She heard more from Dutch, who had a sister in Caldwell Flats and reported back with the grim efficiency of a man doing reconnaissance. "It's her," Dutch said flatly. "My sister saw her talking to Reverend Marsh's wife. That woman's a telegraph line for gossip, and Vivian knows it." "I know," Eleanor said. "What are you going to do?" "Keep cooking," she said. "What else?" It was the right answer and also the frustrating one, and she knew Dutch found it unsatisfying from the way he pressed his mouth flat and nodded and went back to his work. But she wasn't going to run into Caldwell Flats swinging her fists at a rumor. That was exactly what Vivian wanted. Eleanor out in public, angry, proving the kind of woman she was supposed to be. 2 weeks after Vivian's arrival, Gideon came to the kitchen with a look she hadn't seen on him since the letter. "The bank in Caldwell Flats is reconsidering the note on the North Pasture expansion," he said. 40 acres I bought in November. The loan's not due till September, but the bank manager is suddenly talking about calling it early." Eleanor set down what she was doing. "Harcourt money." "Harcourt money," he confirmed. His voice was even, but evenness on Gideon was sometimes the loudest thing in the room. "Her father owns 30% of that bank. Has since before I arrived here." "Can you pay it if they call it?" "Not immediately. Not without selling cattle I'm not ready to sell." He looked at her. "This is about me, Eleanor, not you. I want you to know that." "It's about me," she said quietly. "We both know that." He didn't argue, which meant she was right. "What are your options?" she asked. "I can go to the bank and fight it. I can try to buy out the note privately, or I can—" He stopped. "Or you can give her what she wants," Eleanor said. The silence that followed was long. "That is not an option," Gideon said. His voice had changed quality. It had gone to that flat, final tone she'd heard him use exactly once before, when a cattle buyer had tried to shortchange him on account, and Gideon had looked at him and said quietly that they were done for the day, and probably all other days. "That has not been an option since she drove her carriage into my life and tried to tell me how to live it, and it is not an option now." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about 11 years in Caldwell Flats, about all the time she had made herself smaller to avoid taking up space that made other people uncomfortable, about the specific exhaustion of that, the way it hollows you out from the inside. "All right," she said, "then we deal with it." "We," he said, not as a question. "We," she said. The barn fire happened on a Thursday night in early April. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. She was through her door and running before she was fully awake, and she came around the corner of the main house and saw the orange light against the black sky and felt her stomach drop to her feet. The south barn, feed storage, 2 horses wintered inside, the good tack, was burning from the back corner, and the men were already there with buckets, but the fire had gotten enough of a head start to be serious. Eleanor didn't stop to think. She turned around, grabbed every pot and basin in her kitchen, filled them from the pump, and started moving water. It took 2 hours to bring it down to something controllable. They lost the back third of the barn. One horse had to be moved fast and spooked badly in the process, and pulled Dutch's shoulder half out of its socket before they got it secured. The tack was mostly saved. The feed was mostly gone. After, when the smoke was down to a sullen haze, and the men were standing around with the specific silence of people who have done hard physical work in fear and are now coming off it, Harlan walked the perimeter of the burned section and came back to Gideon. "Started in the corner," Harlan said. "I found this." He held up a piece of cloth, charred at one end. It was wedged in the wallboards, rags soaked in something. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Someone said it," Gideon said. "Someone said it," Harlan confirmed. Every man standing there knew who. Nobody said the name out loud. They didn't need to. Gideon's face in the firelight was something Eleanor would not forget. Not rage. She'd expected rage. It was something colder than that. The face of a man who had just had a line crossed that he'd warned someone not to cross. "Dutch," he said, "get your shoulder looked at. Tomas, take the horses to the north paddock for tonight. Everyone else, Get some sleep. He looked at Eleanor last. Come inside, Chet, he said. She followed him into the main house, into the study she'd never been in, a square room with a desk and 2 chairs and shelves of ledger books that told the whole history of Iron Ridge in numbers. He poured 2 measures of whiskey and handed her one without asking, and she took it without protest because her hands had started shaking again, the way they'd shaken after the blizzard, and the whiskey helped. She's not going to stop, Eleanor said. No. The banknote. The rumors? Now this. She looked at her glass. What's next? The well, he said grimly. Or the cattle. Or she finds someone to file a legal challenge on the land title. She's done that before to other people. Her father taught her to use the courts like a weapon. He paused. She has options and she's going to use them all. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, She came to see me. The first week. She said you had a weakness for strays. He was very still. She said you'd get tired of this. Eleanor turned her glass in her hands. She wasn't talking to me, really. She was talking at me, trying to put something in my head that would make me leave on my own so she wouldn't have to push. Did it work? He asked. His voice was very quiet. Eleanor looked at him. I'm still here, aren't I? Something in his face shifted, and it was that thing again, that quality she hadn't named yet, and the whiskey and the firelight and the smell of smoke still on both of them made naming it feel a little more possible than it had before. Eleanor. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks now. Not formally, not as an employee, but as someone specific, someone he meant to speak to directly. I need to tell you something. Then tell me. I'm going to go to Vivian tomorrow, and I'm going to tell her that what she's doing needs to stop, that there are legal consequences for arson, and that I'm prepared to pursue them. He paused. And I'm going to tell her that whatever she thinks is going to happen, whatever version of the future she's decided on, it isn't going to happen. Because I'm... Another pause, longer this time. Because there are things at Iron Ridge that matter more to me than a clean fight. Eleanor held very still. Things. He looked at her directly. Gideon Blackridge, who kept everything behind his face and who was not keeping this behind his face right now. You, he said. If I'm being plain about it. The words sat in the room between them. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The fire in the hearth was the only sound. I don't know what to do with that, she said finally. Honest because she was always honest when she remembered to be. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to do anything with it tonight. He looked at his hands. I wanted you to know that she can't offer me anything that would make me tell you to go. I wanted you to hear that from me, directly. Eleanor set her whiskey glass down. She thought about 34 years. She thought about the cabin with the frost on the windows and the flour running low, and 11 years of being the woman nobody chose. All right, she said, and she meant it as more than agreement. She meant it as the beginning of something she hadn't had a word for yet. She went back to her kitchen and did not sleep very much. The next morning, she discovered the well. Cody found it first. Or rather, he found the smell first, and then the oily sheen on the surface of the water. And he came to get Eleanor before he told anyone else, because that was who he went to now when something was wrong and needed thinking about. She looked at it, crouched down, smelled it, looked at the color of the water against the stone. Don't drink from it, she said. Tell the men, nobody draws from this well. What is it? Something was put in it. She stood up. The creek water's clean. The men can use that until this is dealt with. Cody looked at the well with the expression of a young man encountering something that doesn't fit in the category of problems he thought the world contained. She poisoned the well. Someone did. Eleanor kept her voice flat. Not because she wasn't angry. She was furious. In the deep, quiet way, she was furious about things that crossed the line from cruelty into something that could actually hurt people. Go tell Harlan, then find Mr. Blackridge. By the time Gideon returned from his confrontation with Vivian, he found Eleanor supervising a chain of men hauling creek water in every available container, having redirected the entire water supply of Iron Ridge Ranch in the space of 4 hours. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. How'd it go? She asked. She denied the barn, he said. Smiled while she did it. As for the well, he shook his head. She'll deny that too. We can't prove it. I know. She offered me money. He said it flatly. Not for me. For you. $10,000, she said, if you'd leave Wyoming voluntarily and not return. Eleanor stopped moving. She looked at him. That's a lot of money. It is. Did you tell her my answer? I told her you weren't for sale, he said, and that if she came near my property again, I would have her arrested for arson. Can you prove arson? Harlan's keeping that cloth, he said. And 3 men saw where the fire started. It won't be easy, but it's not nothing. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. $10,000. She thought about that briefly, the way you think about an amount of money that could completely change what your life looked like, and she noticed that the thought didn't pull her toward anything except a kind of tired contempt. She thinks everything has a price, Eleanor said. She was raised that way, Gideon said. Her father bought his way into everything. She thinks that's how the world works. And what does she think is happening here? What does she think this is between... Eleanor stopped herself. He looked at her carefully. Between us? The words were out, and the question was out, and the kitchen doorway, and the molasses cake, and the whiskey, and the name he'd said, you, were all sitting in the space between them. Yes, she said, between us. He crossed the yard toward her. He stopped close enough that she could see the smoke still faint in his coat from last night, and the exhaustion in his face from a morning spent doing something that had cost him more than he'd shown. I think she's afraid of it, he said, because she understands that there are things you can't buy. Eleanor held his gaze. In all her 34 years, she had not been looked at this way, and had stopped expecting to be, which made it harder to stand steady under it, not easier. We have to deal with her, Eleanor said, not just weather her. She's not going to stop. I know. Then we have to stop her. She thought about it. She's working through fear and gossip and money. That only works if people believe her version. They believe the rumors, if they're afraid of the Harcourt name. She paused. But the people she's using to spread the stories, they're the same people I've been selling pies to for 11 years. They know me, or they think they do. What are you thinking? She looked at him steadily. I'm thinking it's time to stop avoiding Caldwell Flats and go into town. The tension in his face shifted. Not relief, something more guarded than relief. That's walking into her ground. I know. Eleanor pulled her apron off and folded it neatly over the fence post, which was a decisive gesture, the kind that meant something was decided. But hiding here and waiting for the next thing she burns is not a strategy. Vivian Harcourt is used to the people she targets going quiet, going small, running. And you're not going to do that. I have spent 34 years going small, Eleanor said. I am done with it. She went to Caldwell Flats the next day. She went alone, which Gideon argued about, and then stopped arguing about when he saw her face. She drove the supply wagon herself, which she hadn't done since she arrived, and she arrived in town at 10 in the morning when the streets were at their busiest. She went to the general store first. The Hendersons were there, bless them, and Margaret Henderson saw her come through the door and crossed the room immediately and took both her hands in the way of a woman who has decided whose side she's on. I've been hearing terrible things, Margaret said quietly. I know, Eleanor said. I imagine you've known for some time what the source of them is. Margaret's expression was complicated. Vivian Harcourt's father helped this town a great deal 20 years ago. People have long memories. Do they have longer memories for what he helped with? Or for what it cost them? Margaret looked at her, sharp eyes and a kind face. You're going to ask me to do something. I'm going to ask you to tell the truth, Eleanor said, to whoever asks you, about what you've seen and what you've heard and who's been doing the telling. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she squeezed Eleanor's hands and released them. I've been doing that already, she said, but I'll do it louder. The conversation with the Reverend's wife was harder. She was a woman who collected other people's stories and arranged them for maximum effect, and Eleanor had known women like this all her life. They weren't cruel exactly. They were just careless about the damage their words did, and they confused being interesting with being right. Eleanor sat with her in the parlor of the church meeting room and listened to a solid 5 minutes of concerned questions designed to get Eleanor to say something quotable, and at the end of it she said quietly, "Mrs. Marsh, if someone burned your well, what would you want your neighbors to do?" The woman blinked. "Because someone burned mine," Eleanor said, "and someone put something in the water. And I'm not asking you to take my side. I'm asking you to think about what kind of town you want to live in and who's building it and who's burning it." She left before Mrs. Marsh could form a response. She was coming out of the dry goods store when she saw Vivienne. Vivienne was across the street, standing outside the bank with the bank manager, and she saw Eleanor at the same moment Eleanor saw her. For one beat, they simply looked at each other across the width of the muddy Caldwell Flats Main Street, and Eleanor felt the full weight of what this woman had done. The fire and the well and the rumors and the money offered like Eleanor was a problem to be cleared away. And she made a decision. She crossed the street. She heard Vivienne say something quick and low to the bank manager, who retreated inside with the specific speed of a man who recognizes an exit and takes it. And then it was just the two of them, in the middle of Caldwell Flats, on a Tuesday morning, with half the town finding reasons to be near their windows. "Miss Ashcroft?" Vivienne said, still pleasant. The pleasantness was impressive, actually. It was like watching a weapon stay sheathed. "Miss Harcourt," Eleanor stopped 3 feet away. "I want to tell you something." "By all means." "I have been dismissed, mocked, ignored, and underestimated my entire life," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, and she was proud of that. "I've been called names in public. I've had doors closed in my face. I've had people laugh when they thought I couldn't hear." She paused. "And I'm still here. Every single time, I'm still here." Vivienne's pleasant expression was holding, but something behind it was less certain than it had been. "What you've done, the barn, the well, the stories, none of that is new to me," Eleanor said. "The only difference is that this time I have people around me, and they saw it, and they know what you are." "You're threatening me," Vivienne said. Her voice had finally lost the pleasantness. Underneath it was something colder and harder. "A cook, threatening me." "I'm telling you the truth," Eleanor said, "because I think it's possible that nobody has done that for you in a very long time, and I think you've mistaken being rich for being right." She looked at her steadily. "You can keep doing what you're doing. You can burn more things and poison more things and buy more people, and I'll still be at Iron Ridge making breakfast when you run out of things to buy." Vivienne stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, something real crossed her face. Not rage, something that looked almost incongruously like recognition. Then it was gone. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but I won't regret it more than I'd regret running." She walked back across the street to her wagon. She climbed up on the seat. She did not look back, because looking back would have cost her something she wasn't willing to spend. Her hands were shaking on the reins, and she let them shake, and she drove home. The men were waiting in the yard when she got back. Not because they'd been told to, but because somehow they knew, the way people who live in close quarters always know when something is happening. Harlan was there, and Dutch with his arm in a sling, and Cody, who had probably been watching the road since she left, and the Alvarez brothers, who stood together as they always did, a solid unit. She drove the wagon into the yard and set the brake and sat there for a moment. "Well," Harlan said. "She knows we're not going anywhere," Eleanor said. "Whether that changes anything, I don't know yet." "It changes something," Harlan said. He said it with the particular weight of a man who has spent 14 years on a ranch, watching what changes things and what doesn't. "You went. That changes something." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were steady, which surprised her a little. Gideon was at the kitchen door. He'd been there the whole time, she realized, waiting. She walked toward him, and he held the door open, and she went inside into the warmth and the smell of the kitchen that was hers, and she heard the door close behind her, and for a moment she just stood there in the middle of her kitchen and felt the full weight of what she'd done and the full weight of what hadn't broken. "All right?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but close enough." He nodded. He didn't crowd her with questions or comfort, which was exactly right. which was so exactly Gideon that it ached a little. She went to the stove. She had supper to make. Outside, Vivian Harcourt stood in the middle of Caldwell Flats Main Street for a long time after Eleanor's wagon disappeared, and the expression on her face was not the one she would have chosen for anyone to see, which was why it was fortunate that most of the townspeople had gone back to what they were doing, having seen what they needed to see. It was the expression of a woman who had just been told the truth, and recognized it, and didn't know what to do with that except to find another way to make it stop. She was not finished. Eleanor knew that. Everyone at Iron Ridge knew that. But something had shifted in the long, ugly war Vivian was waging. Something that had to do with the way the town had watched Eleanor cross that street, and the way the men at Iron Ridge had been standing in the yard when she came home, and the way Gideon Blackridge had held a door open and waited. It was a small shift, but Eleanor Ashcroft had built her whole life out of small shifts, and she knew better than most what they could become. Vivian's next move came 4 days later, and it came through the law, which was the one thing Eleanor hadn't fully anticipated. The county land assessor arrived at Iron Ridge on a Saturday morning with a document that had official seals on it and the specific apologetic manner of a man who knows he's being used but has decided his job is worth more than his conscience. He handed the document to Gideon at the front gate and explained with great care for the technical language and very little eye contact that a formal challenge had been filed against the title of the North Pasture parcel, the 40 acres Gideon had purchased in November, on the grounds of a disputed boundary survey from 1871. Gideon read the document twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and said, "Who filed it?" The assessor looked at a point somewhere past Gideon's left ear. "The filing was made by the Harcourt Land Trust, Mr. Blackridge, on behalf of the estate. The Harcourt Land Trust has no claim to that parcel. The boundary survey from 1871 was superseded by the federal survey in 1874. That's on record." "Yes, sir, I'm aware of that." "Then you're also aware that this challenge has no legal standing." "The challenge will need to go before Judge Calloway and Rawlings," the assessor said, "to be formally dismissed. That process takes—" He paused. "Time. How much time?" 4 to 6 weeks, typically, during which period the title is technically in dispute and any financial instrument secured against the parcel would be— He stopped. "Frozen," Gideon said flatly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackridge." Gideon looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, with something more deliberate than anger. "You've known me 11 years, Walter." The assessor, Walter, finally met his eyes. He looked genuinely miserable. "I know it, Gideon. I'm sorry, I don't have grounds to refuse the filing. I would if I could." Gideon nodded once. "All right. Thank you for bringing it yourself." Walter left. Gideon came inside and found Eleanor in the kitchen and told her, and she listened without interrupting, the way she always listened when information mattered. When he finished, she said, "The loan on the North Pasture. If the title's frozen, the bank can call it immediately. They don't have to wait for September." "Yes. And if they call it, I sell cattle I can't afford to sell yet, or I default." He sat down at the table. "Neither of those is good." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the loan, and about the bank, and about the 30% that Vivian's father's estate still held in it, and about the assessor named Walter who had known Gideon for 11 years and looked genuinely miserable about what he'd been sent to do. "Walter didn't want to file it," she said. "No. Which means there are people being used who don't particularly want to be used." She turned to look at him. "That matters. People who are doing someone else's dirty work and don't like it, they're more useful to us than people who agree with her." Gideon looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need a lawyer," she said. "And I'm thinking we need to talk to every rancher in this valley who has ever had dealings with the Harcourt Land Trust. Because I'd be willing to bet we're not the first." She was right. They were not the first. Gideon spent the next 3 days riding out to neighboring ranches, and what he came back with was a picture that was worse than they'd imagined in its details, and better than they'd imagined in its implications. The Harcourt family, Vivian's father primarily, though Vivian had learned the trade well, had used the same playbook on at least 4 other landholders in the territory over the past 15 years. Disputed surveys, bank pressure, rumor campaigns. Two of those families had sold and left. One had fought and lost. One, a rancher named Abel Croft, 62 years old, and built like a man who had spent his entire life arguing with weather, had fought and won because he'd had the documentation and the stubbornness to outlast the challenge. Gideon brought Abel Croft back with him on the third day. Eleanor was in the kitchen when they came through the door, and Croft looked at her with the quick assessing look of a man deciding something, and apparently he decided it quickly, because he sat down at her kitchen table and said, "I heard about you. Margaret Henderson told my wife." "Good things, I hope," Eleanor said. "She said you were the most practical woman in the territory," he said. "Coming from Margaret, that's a significant thing." "Coffee?" Eleanor asked. "Please," he said. "And then let's talk about how to deal with the Harcourts, because I have been waiting 11 years for someone else to have the fight I already had, so I could help them do it better." What Abel Croft had that they needed was documentation. He'd kept every piece of paper from his own title challenge, the original filings, the counterfiling, the survey records, the correspondence. He'd kept them because he'd been through it once and knew that the Harcourts didn't stop, and that the day might come when he'd need to show someone else the map of the minefield. He spread the papers on Eleanor's kitchen table, her kitchen table, which had become in the past months the table where everything important got decided at Iron Ridge, and walked them through it. "The key is the federal survey records," he said. "The 1874 survey supersedes everything before it, and those records are held in Cheyenne. The Harcourts know this. What they're betting on is that it'll take you longer to get those records to Rawlings than it'll take the bank to call the note. So the question is, how fast can you get a lawyer to Cheyenne?" "I know a man in Laramie," Gideon said. "He can be in Cheyenne in 2 days." "Get him moving today," Croft said. "Don't wait till Monday. Today." Gideon looked at Eleanor. She nodded. He got up and went to write the telegram. Croft watched him go, then looked at Eleanor with the frank appraisal of a man who wasn't going to waste time on politeness. "You're the cook." "I am." "You're also apparently the reason she's doing this." Eleanor met his eyes. "That's what it looks like." He nodded slowly. "Vivian Harcourt is her father's daughter. He went after people who had something he wanted. She goes after people who have something she can't have." He paused. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand," Eleanor said. She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying it to embarrass you," Croft said. "I'm saying it because knowing why she's doing it tells you how far she'll go. With my land, it was about money and expansion. With this," he gestured loosely, "this is personal. Personal means she won't stop at practical. She'll keep going past the point where it makes sense." Eleanor looked at the papers on the table. Survey records, boundary descriptions, legal correspondence, the paper architecture of someone trying to take what didn't belong to them. "Then we go past the point where it makes sense too," she said. Croft looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I think you might actually do that." The lawyer's name was Hammond, and he was in Cheyenne within 48 hours, and the federal survey records were in his hands within 72. He filed the counter documents in Rawlings on a Thursday and sent Gideon a telegram that said simply, "Challenge has no standing. Judge Calloway aware. Bank notified. Proceed." When Gideon read that telegram aloud in the kitchen, Harlan Briggs, who happened to be in the room getting his morning coffee, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Good," in the tone of a man who had been clenching his teeth for a week and had just been told he could stop. The bank, however, was not finished. The manager, a man named Pearson, who had the look of someone who had once had principles and had replaced them with something more durable, called the note anyway. Not on the north pasture, which he could no longer legally touch, but on a different instrument, a 5-year operating loan that Gideon had taken out 3 years ago, and which had a clause buried in the original language that allowed the bank to demand full payment if the primary borrower's business circumstances materially changed. Pearson argued, with Vivian's lawyer's help, that the title challenge constituted a material change. It was a thin argument. Hammond said so immediately. But thin arguments in front of friendly judges had a way of thickening, and Pearson knew which judges in the county had borrowed money from the Harcourt interests over the years. This was the moment, the Tuesday morning when Hammond's second telegram arrived explaining the operating loan situation, that Eleanor would later think of as the low point. Not the barn fire, not the poisoned well, not the rumors. This. Because this was the moment when the math got genuinely bad. Gideon read the telegram alone in his study, but Eleanor knew about it within an hour because nothing stayed contained at Iron Ridge anymore. The men felt what was happening even when they didn't have the specifics, the way animals know weather before it shows. She found him at his desk with the ledger books open, which was never a good sign. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She sat in the chair across from his desk and listened, and when he was done, she said, "What do you need to cover it?" He named a figure. It was significant. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have savings." He looked up sharply. 11 years of baking pies in Caldwell Flats, she said. "I don't spend much. I've never had much to spend it on." She paused. "It's not enough to cover all of it, but it might be enough to make the difference between keeping the cattle and selling them." "Eleanor," his voice was careful, "I'm not taking your savings." "It's not a gift," she said. "I'm a practical woman. I don't make gifts of money I don't have to spare. It would be a loan at reasonable interest with terms we write down." "That is not—" "Gideon," she looked at him steadily. "This is my home too. You told me that. You said I belong here more than anyone who's walked through that door." She paused. "I'm asking you to let me act like it." The silence in the study was long. The ledger book sat open on the desk between them, all those numbers that told the story of 11 years of building something. "The interest rate," he said finally. "Standard," she said. "I'm not charitable. I'm practical." Something crossed his face that she'd been seeing more of lately, that expression she'd stopped refusing to name, somewhere around the week of the barn fire, when she'd decided that refusing to name things was just another way of going small. "All right," he said. "Standard interest. Written terms." "Good," she said, and she went back to the kitchen and made supper. It was Abelcroft who solved the wider problem, though not alone. He'd gone home after his visit to Iron Ridge and talked to his wife, and his wife had talked to 2 other women whose husbands ranched in the valley, and those women talked to their husbands, and by the end of the week there was a meeting, not at Iron Ridge, at the Croft Ranch, neutral ground, which was the right instinct. 8 ranchers from the valley and the surrounding territory sitting around Abelcroft's big table, with Gideon at one end and Abel at the other, and a lot of coffee and very direct conversation happening in between. Eleanor wasn't there. She'd told Gideon to go, and she'd stayed at Iron Ridge, and she'd baked for 2 hours because baking was what she did when she needed her hands busy and her mind free to work. He came back at 10 that night, and she was still in the kitchen. "They're with us," he said. "All 8. She set down the rolling pin. "What does that mean practically?" "It means Croft and 2 others are going to file formal complaints with the Territorial Land Office about the Harcourt Trust's pattern of survey challenges. It means another 2 are going to the bank, not as borrowers, as investors, and making clear that Harcourt pressure on legitimate loans is going to cost that bank their business from the valley." He sat down. "And it means that if we need it, there are 8 ranches worth of support behind Iron Ridge." Eleanor thought about that. 8 ranches. Cattle and land and water rights, and the kind of collective weight that even a Harcourt couldn't easily dismiss. "Why?" she asked. Not skeptically, genuinely wanting to understand. Gideon looked at her. "Because Croft asked them, and because, apparently," he paused. "Several of them mentioned you specifically, what you'd done, going into town. Margaret Henderson's been talking." "Of course she has," Eleanor said. She wasn't annoyed. Margaret Henderson talking was actually a significant strategic asset, and Eleanor was not above using strategic assets. "There was something else," Gideon said. He was looking at the table. "Croft's wife, she asked about you, about who you were. And I told her about your cooking, and about the blizzard, and about going to town and talking to Vivian on the street." He paused. "She said—" He stopped. "What did she say?" He looked up. She said, "That's the woman who should be running this valley." Eleanor stared at him. Then she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. "That's generous." "I don't think she meant it as flattery," he said. "I think she meant it as fact." The hearing in Rawlings, the formal dismissal of the title challenge, which was what it came down to, happened on a Thursday in late April. Gideon went with Hammond. Eleanor stayed at Iron Ridge and made breakfast and then made lunch, and then found herself unable to concentrate on supper preparations because her mind kept going to a courtroom in Rawlings and what was happening in it. Harlan found her standing at the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon, looking at nothing. "He'll be back by dark," Harlan said. "I know. Hammond's a good lawyer." "I know that too." Harlan was quiet for a moment, which was his natural state, and then he said, "You know, when I told Blackridge he should hire someone to cook, I told him to get a man. Figured a man would stand up to the crew better." Eleanor looked at him. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way Harlan said anything he meant, flat and clean, no ornamentation. "I want you to know that I know I was wrong." "I know you were wrong too," Eleanor said, "but thank you for saying it." He nodded, poured himself a coffee, sat down at the table like he had nowhere better to be, which was its own kind of company, and Eleanor went back to her supper preparations with the feeling of not being alone in a room, which she had missed for 11 years without quite knowing the name of what she was missing. Gideon came back before dark. She heard the horse from the kitchen and was at the door before he dismounted. She could tell from the way he moved. He was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that came from tension releasing all at once, and he was something else that she needed him to be close enough to read. He came through the yard and up to the kitchen door and stopped 2 feet from her. "Dismissed," he said. "Complete dismissal. Judge Calloway put it on the record that the survey challenge was without merit and that any future challenges to Iron Ridge title would require extraordinary evidence." Eleanor exhaled. "The bank manager," Gideon continued, "received a letter this afternoon from 7 Valley ranchers indicating their intention to move their accounts if the operating loan demand isn't withdrawn. Pearson withdrew it before end of business." "7," she said. "Croft found another one." "Apparently, yes." Something in his face was releasing, the way a held breath releases. "It's not over. Vivian still has money and connections and—" "Gideon." He stopped. "Is it over enough for tonight?" she asked. He looked at her, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 4 months of watching his face. He smiled, not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth suggestion of one. A real one, tired and genuine and crooked at one edge. "Yes," he said. "It's over enough for tonight." "Good," she said. "Supper's ready." It was the best supper she'd made at Iron Ridge. She didn't plan it that way. She'd started it before she knew the outcome. But the ancho beef was perfect, the bread had come out right, and somewhere in the supply stores she'd found the last of the dried apple and made a proper tart with it, and the kitchen smelled like everything she'd built here over 4 months. The men ate like men who'd been worried and were now not worried, which was its own kind of appetite. Cole Decker, of all people, took a second piece of the tart and looked over at Eleanor and said gruffly, "This is real good." It was the first direct compliment he'd paid her in 4 months. She received it without making a moment of it. "There's a third piece," she said, "if nobody else wants it." He took the third piece. She noticed that Cody was watching this exchange with the expression of a young man witnessing something that restored his faith in the basic possibility of people, and she didn't say anything about that either. The shift in Caldwell Flats started quietly, the way shifts in small towns always did, not with a dramatic moment, but with a series of small corrections, people quietly updating the story they'd been telling based on new information. Margaret Henderson had been at work, that much was clear. But it wasn't just Margaret. Walter the assessor, who had known Gideon for 11 years and disliked what he'd been asked to do, had apparently been saying so to anyone who asked. The Alvarez brothers' letters home to New Mexico had produced not just Chile shipments, but a cousin who was looking for ranch work, and his arrival in Caldwell Flats came with secondhand stories about Iron Ridge that made the place sound like somewhere worth going. Small things, adding up. Eleanor went to Caldwell Flats twice more in April, not with any specific confrontational purpose, but simply because she had errands and she lived near the town and she had decided to stop letting that feel complicated. The first time, the general store was awkward. She could feel the realignment happening in the room. People who had repeated Vivian's stories now performing a kind of retroactive neutrality, which was the best you could realistically hope for. The second time, a woman she didn't know came up to her on the street and said, "You're the woman from Iron Ridge." And when Eleanor said yes, the woman said, "My husband works the Pemberton cattle north of here. He told me what you did in the blizzard, for the boy." "It wasn't much," Eleanor said. "It was," the woman said simply, and moved on. These were not grand gestures, but Eleanor Ashcroft had spent a long time understanding that the world mostly moved in things that weren't grand gestures, and she had learned to take the small ones seriously. The thing with Vivian that she'd been waiting for came on the last Friday of April. Vivian came to Iron Ridge one more time. She came alone, without the performative carriage entrance, just a horse and a woman who had clearly made a decision about something. Eleanor was in the yard when she arrived. She'd been helping Cody with a fence repair, which was not kitchen work but had become the kind of thing she did at Iron Ridge without much deliberation because the place needed it. And she watched Vivian dismount and stand with the reins in her hands and look at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm not here to fight," Vivian said. She sounded tired. Eleanor looked at her more carefully and saw that she was, in fact, tired. Not the performed weariness of a woman making a point, but the real kind that sat behind the eyes. "Then what are you here for?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know exactly." Vivian looked around the yard, at the repaired barn, at the house, at the kitchen window where the light was on because it always was. "I wanted to see it." "See what?" "What he built." A pause. "What you both built." Eleanor kept her hands loose at her sides. This was a different Vivian than the one who had come to her kitchen door in March, with pleasantness covering something cold. This one was smaller, not in stature, but in some interior dimension, the way a person gets smaller when they've spent a lot of energy on something and it hasn't worked. "Your lawyers have withdrawn the title challenge," Eleanor said. "Your bank pressure on the operating loan has been reversed. Your father's land trust is under complaint with the territorial office." "I know," Vivian said. "So what is it you're actually here to do?" Vivian looked at her directly. "My father used to say that you could measure a person by what they were willing to do to win." She stopped. "I've been thinking about that, about what I've done in the last 2 months." She looked at the barn, the repaired corner, still newer lumber than the rest. "I set a fire." "I know," Eleanor said. "I could have hurt someone." "Dutch dislocated his shoulder," Eleanor said. Not accusatory, just fact. Vivian's jaw tightened. "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to apologize to you. I don't think you'd believe it, and I'm not sure I've earned the right to make it." "That's honest, at least," Eleanor said. "I wanted what I thought was mine," Vivian said. "I always want what I think is mine. My father was the same." She looked at Eleanor, and there was something in the look that was as close to genuine as Eleanor had seen from her. "I don't know what to do with the fact that what I wanted wasn't mine to begin with." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what Abel Croft had said. Personal means she won't stop at practical. And she thought about the fact that Vivian was standing here in her yard, alone, without a plan, which was the most surprising thing she'd done in 2 months. "You go home," Eleanor said quietly. "You go home and you stop. Not because you lost, though you did, but because some things aren't worth what you pay for them." She paused. "Your father's land trust is under complaint. That's going to take time to resolve. But if you stop now and you stay stopped, I'll tell Gideon the complaint doesn't need to go further." Vivian stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm not interested in destroying you," Eleanor said. "I'm interested in being left alone." She held Vivian's gaze. "Can you do that? Leave us alone?" Vivian was very still for a long moment. "Yes," she said. It came out rough and flat, like something that had cost her. She mounted her horse. She didn't look back as she rode out. Cody appeared from around the corner of the barn. He'd been there the whole time, Eleanor suspected, because Cody had not quite grown out of the protective instinct he'd developed around her over the past months. "Is it done?" he asked. Eleanor watched the dust settle where Vivian's horse had gone. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But it might be." She looked at him. "Finish the fence. We've got about an hour of light left." He picked up his tools and went back to the fence without another word, which was exactly right, and Eleanor stood in the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch in the late April light and felt something that wasn't quite peace. Peace was too simple a word for the complicated territory she'd been navigating, but was close enough to it to breathe in and hold for a moment before the next thing came. That evening, Gideon found her in the kitchen after supper, alone, washing the last of the dishes. He told her about Vivian's stop at the main house after the yard. She'd gone to him before leaving, brief and formal, and told him she was withdrawing from Caldwell Flats and returning to Denver. He'd said almost nothing. There wasn't much to say. "She came to see me first," Eleanor said. He nodded. "I know. Cody told me. I told her if she stopped, the territorial complaint didn't need to go further." He was quiet for a moment. "That was your call to make." "Was it the wrong one?" "No," he said. "I think it was exactly right." He paused. "I think you understood something about her that I missed." "She was doing it because she was lost," Eleanor said. "People like that don't stop because you beat them. They stop when they run out of road." She dried her hands. "She ran out of road." Gideon stood in his kitchen doorway, and the lamp was lit, and outside the last of the April evening was doing something pale and gold with the sky over the ridge, and Eleanor looked at him, looking at her and felt the full weight of 4 months. The biscuits and the blizzard and the burned barn and the poisoned well and the valley ranchers around Abel Croft's table and the woman on the street who said it was, and thought about how none of it had gone the way she would have predicted that morning in January when she'd opened her door to a tall man who ducked under her doorframe and offered her a job. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said, before he could say it, because she did know, had known for some time, and had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around the week Vivian arrived, and she'd discovered that the thought of leaving Iron Ridge was genuinely intolerable. "Do you?" he said, and his voice had that quality, direct and careful and entirely without performance. "I know what you're working up to," she said, "and I'm not going to make it easy for you by saying it first." Something happened in his face. "That seems unfair." "I'm practical," she said. "Not fair." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped close to her, the same way he'd stopped close to her in the yard after Rawlings, close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes, which she did without looking away. "I'd like to ask you something," he said, "when you're ready to hear it." "I'm not sure I'll ever be entirely ready," she said, "but ask anyway." He asked. The lamp burned in the kitchen at Iron Ridge, and outside the ridge had gone from gold to dark, and somewhere in the territory the first real warmth of spring was deciding to arrive, and Eleanor Ashcroft, who had spent 34 years being the woman nobody chose, stood in her kitchen and gave an answer that surprised her mostly in how certain it was, how completely without the ambivalence she'd expected to feel, how much it sounded like something she'd known for a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment to say out loud. She said yes on a Tuesday, which was not a romantic day in any particular sense, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and the last of the ancho beef, and Gideon hadn't gotten down on one knee because neither of them was built for that kind of theater. He'd simply asked, standing in her kitchen with the lamp between them, and she'd simply answered, and that was probably exactly right for both of them. The practical complications of the answer kept them busy enough that the emotional weight of it took a few days to fully arrive. There was the question of the ring, which Gideon handled by going to the jeweler in Caldwell Flats and coming back with something that was not elaborate. A simple band with a small inset stone, nothing that would snag on a mixing bowl rim or catch in the fire grate. He presented it at breakfast without ceremony, sliding it across the kitchen table while she was pouring coffee, and she picked it up and looked at it and put it on and went back to the coffee. He watched her do this and seemed satisfied in a way that a man satisfied by grand gestures would not have understood, but that Eleanor understood perfectly. "It fits," she said. I measured by tracing your glove, he said, while you were asleep. But she looked at him over the coffee pot. That's either romantic or unsettling. Practical, he said. You've been spending time with me, she said. He smiled, the real one, crooked at the edge, and went to find Harlan, and Eleanor stood in her kitchen with a ring on her finger and the coffee pot in her hand and felt something she didn't have a precise word for, something that was partly joy and partly the specific disorientation of a person who has expected a certain kind of life for so long that a different kind arriving feels almost like a misunderstanding that hasn't been corrected yet. She told herself it wasn't a misunderstanding. She told herself that several times over the next week until she stopped needing to. The men found out the way the men found out everything at Iron Ridge, all at once, through some communication network that Eleanor had never fully mapped but had come to accept as a feature of the place. She didn't announce it. Gideon didn't announce it. Cody saw the ring on Wednesday morning and said, "Oh," in a very particular tone, and by Wednesday evening, every man on the ranch knew. The response was characteristically Iron Ridge, which meant that nobody made a speech, and nobody cried, and nobody did anything that would require anyone else to manage their feelings about it. Harlan shook Gideon's hand and nodded at Eleanor with the depth of regard that was, from Harlan, essentially a standing ovation. Dutch said, "About time," which was debatable in terms of accuracy given that Eleanor had been there 5 months, but she understood the spirit. The Alvarez brothers brought out a bottle of something from Tomas's gear that turned out to be very strong and very good, and there was a brief gathering in the kitchen that got slightly louder than Iron Ridge gatherings usually got. And Cole Decker, Cole of all people, she raised a cup in Eleanor's direction and said, "You're all right, Miss Ashcroft," and she received that for what it was, which was more than she would have bet on in January. Cody cried a little in the corner and then looked mortified about it, and Eleanor pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing she could do for him. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in June when the Wyoming sky was doing the thing it did in early summer, that particular blue, high and clear and enormous. The kind of sky that made you understand why people had been coming to this territory and staying despite everything it threw at them. It was not a large wedding. Eleanor had no family within 400 miles and had not expected any, and Gideon's family was a brother in Montana who sent a letter of congratulations and a practical gift of cured venison, which Eleanor appreciated more than flowers. The guests were the men of Iron Ridge, the Croft family, Margaret Henderson and her husband, Walter the assessor, who had known Gideon 11 years and looked genuinely happy to be there, and a collection of valley ranchers and their families who had not been invited exactly, but had heard and arrived anyway, which Eleanor had been told was how things worked out here when people decided they cared about something. The reverend who performed the ceremony was not the sort who made speeches. He was a small man from the eastern settlement who had apparently heard the broad outline of the past several months and had formed opinions about it, and when he got to the part of the ceremony that in Eleanor's experience often became an occasion for the officiant to share his thoughts on marriage and womanhood and what women ought to be, he simply did not do that. He said the words, and Gideon said his, and Eleanor said hers, and the ring went from her right hand to her left, and it was done. What happened after was less ceremonial and more Iron Ridge. There was food, enormous quantities of food, because Eleanor had been cooking for 3 days and had lost track of when to stop, and the result was a table that sagged slightly under the weight of what was on it, and nobody complained. The Croft children, who were old enough to run, but young enough to do it without any particular destination in mind, ran. Cody and Marco played something on a shared harmonica that was arguably music. Harlan sat with Abel Croft, and they talked in the specific way of two men who respected each other and had recently been through something, and were quietly acknowledging both facts without saying either one directly. Gideon stood beside Eleanor through most of it. Not attached to her, not hovering, just near, in the way of a person who had chosen a direction and was comfortable with the choice. She felt him there the way you feel the warmth from a stove, present and steady. And she thought that this was probably what people meant when they talked about not being alone, and that she had not understood what they meant until now. Margaret Henderson found her near the end of the afternoon, when the food was mostly gone, and the children were flagging, and the general energy of the gathering was settling into the satisfied quietness of a day that had gone well. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said. She had the look of a woman who had been thinking about this for a while. When Gideon came to me and asked about a cook, I told him about you. I want you to know why. Because I was the best cook in the territory, Eleanor said. Because you were the most stubborn person I knew, Margaret said, and I thought this ranch needed stubbornness more than it needed cooking. She paused. I was right about the stubbornness. The cooking was a bonus. Eleanor looked at her. That's a very backhanded compliment. I know, Margaret said. I'm known for them. She took Eleanor's hands briefly, the way she'd done in the general store in March. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. I want you to know that somebody is. Eleanor held on to that. She held on to it quietly, the way she held on to the things that mattered, not making a show of them, just keeping them somewhere close. Vivian Harcourt did not come to the wedding. Eleanor had not expected her to. The Territorial Land Office complaint had been formally resolved in May. The Harcourt Trust had paid a fine and agreed to submit to independent survey reviews on any future boundary challenges within the territory, which was not the complete destruction of the Harcourt influence, but was a significant curtailment of it. And Eleanor had told Gideon it was enough. She believed that. She also believed that Vivian, wherever she was in Denver, was finding that the version of the story she told about herself was harder to maintain than it had been, and that sometimes that was punishment enough. Eleanor was not a woman who needed her enemies broken. She needed them stopped. Those were different things, and she'd known women who confused them and spent their lives chasing the broken part when the stopped part would have freed them. She was done with Vivian Harcourt. She believed most days that Vivian was done with her too. The first year of their marriage was not easy in the ways that the first year of anything new and real is not easy. Eleanor had to learn how to be in the main house part of her life and in the kitchen for the professional part, and the boundary between those was not always clean. Gideon had spent 11 years living alone on this ranch and had particular ways of doing particular things that were not always compatible with another person's particular ways. And there were arguments, real ones, with edges, about the supply ordering and the division of the accounts, and about the time he spent on the range versus the time he spent on the business side, which Eleanor thought was out of balance and said so directly, which he did not always receive gracefully. She had not expected graceful. She was not graceful either. She was stubborn and precise, and sometimes impatient with people who moved through the world more slowly than she thought the situation required. And she knew this about herself and tried to manage it with mixed success. What they were good at was the same thing they'd always been good at, talking directly. No performance, no strategy, no maneuvering for position. When something was wrong, they said so. When they'd been wrong, they said that too, which was harder, but which they'd both committed to, and which made the arguments finite instead of accumulating. It wasn't a perfect marriage. Eleanor would have been suspicious of a perfect marriage. It was a real one, and she had wanted real for too long to spend any of it wishing it were easier. Reuben, sleepless. Reuben, with the shadows under his eyes, left the ranch that fall. He came to Eleanor's kitchen to tell her before he told Gideon, because that was how things worked at Iron Ridge now, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said he was going back to his family in Ohio, that he'd had a letter from his mother and something in him had shifted, that he thought maybe he'd been running from something long enough. Running's useful up to a point, Eleanor said. Then you have to go back and deal with the thing. I know, he said. He looked better than he had in January. The shadows were lighter, the flinching had largely stopped. She'd noticed that over the months and hadn't mentioned it, but she noticed it now, standing in her kitchen door in the October light. You fixed something, he said. Not specifically, just generally, the way people speak about things that are true but don't have clean edges. I made good food, she said. That's different from fixing something. Maybe, he said, but I've been fed a lot of places, and it's different here. She gave him a package of the dried ancho mix, labeled with the proportions so he could make the beef stew himself if he wanted it. He took it with both hands. Cody stayed. She'd thought he might go when he turned 18 in December. Young men did, when they'd been on a ranch since 17 and had seen enough of one place to get curious about others. But he stayed through his birthday and into the next year, and when she asked him about it once, in the direct way she asked about most things, he said, I left Missouri because I had to. I'm staying here because I want to. She understood the distinction. She'd spent a long time leaving places she had to leave and not enough time choosing places she wanted to be. She chose this one. Every morning she chose it. The letter from the Territorial Women's Aid Society arrived in the second year, addressed to Eleanor Blackridge at Iron Ridge Ranch, which still felt slightly strange to read. She'd been Eleanor Ashcroft for 34 years and had not entirely reassigned herself yet. The letter asked if she would be willing to speak at a gathering in Rawlins about, and this was the part that made her sit down and read the sentence twice, about the experience of women establishing themselves in the frontier territory without family or institutional support. She read it to Gideon at breakfast. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm not a speaker." "You're an effective speaker," he said. "I've heard you. You just don't perform it. That's different from being willing to do it in front of a room full of people who don't know me." "Eleanor," he set his cup down. "You walked across the main street of Caldwell Flats and told Vivian Harcourt the truth to her face, in front of half the town." That was different. How? She thought about it. "That was necessary?" she said finally. "I don't know if this is necessary." "Go find out if it is," he said. "If it's not, you'll know quickly." She went. She spoke in the direct, unperformed way that was the only way she knew how. She talked about the cabin with the frost on the windows, and about arriving at Iron Ridge with a crate of spice tins and a skillet she reached for before she opened the door. She talked about what it was to be looked at a certain way, and to decide, eventually, that the looking said more about the looker than about her. She talked about what it cost to stay and what it would have cost to go, and about the specific difference between running from things and moving toward them. She did not talk about Vivian. She wasn't interested in making Vivian part of her story any more than she had to. After, 3 women came to talk to her separately, and all 3 said versions of the same thing, that they had been in a position she described or were in it now, and that they had not known how to think about it until she said those particular words in that particular order. She drove home to Iron Ridge that evening thinking about that, about words in a particular order, about the fact that what she'd learned in 5 years of cooking for 22 men and building a life in a place nobody had expected her to last was not something she'd expected to have occasion to teach, and about whether she had a responsibility to the teaching. She talked to Gideon about it that night, lying awake in the room that was now their room, in the house that was now their house. "The Women's Aid Society wants me to do it again," she said, "in Laramie this time." "Will you?" "I think so." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about the women I knew in Caldwell Flats, the ones who had nobody and knew it and had stopped fighting it. I was almost one of them, but you weren't. I was stubborn," she said, "like Margaret said. But stubbornness isn't the same as knowing you have a choice." She paused. "I want those women to know they have a choice." He reached across the dark and found her hand. "Then go to Laramie," he said. She went to Laramie, and to Cheyenne the year after that. She did not become famous because she was not interested in famous, and also because the territory was not in the habit of making women famous for the things she was doing. But she became known, in the specific way that useful people become known, as someone to go to when you needed the particular kind of thinking she did, or the particular kind of honesty, or the particular kind of molasses cake, which she brought to every gathering because it was practical, and also because food was the thing she trusted most to tell people that they were worth being fed. At Iron Ridge, things changed in the ways things change when they're alive. Not smoothly, not without cost, but in the direction of something becoming more itself over time. Cody eventually did leave at 20 to pursue something in Wyoming's northern territories involving a woman he'd met at the Croft Ranch gathering. He came back to visit twice a year and wrote more often than that, and Eleanor kept his letters in the kitchen drawer with the good spice tins, which was where she kept things she wanted close. Cole Decker stayed until his 31st birthday, and then married a woman from the eastern settlement and took on a small property of his own 2 valleys over. At his wedding, which Eleanor attended because she had been invited, and because she was a person who accepted invitations from people who had earned the right to offer them, he said to her privately that she'd been the first person who'd managed him without making him feel managed, and that he'd been trying to figure out how to do that with other people ever since, and that it hadn't always worked, but he was still trying. She told him that was the best thing she'd heard in a while. She meant it. Dutch's shoulder healed imperfectly, the way injuries do when they're not quite bad enough for a doctor, but not quite good enough to recover without one. He developed a tilt to how he carried himself that became, over time, just how Dutch looked. And he stayed at Iron Ridge for 12 more years and became the closest thing to a permanent institution the ranch had outside of Eleanor's kitchen itself. The Alvarez brothers' cousin, the one whose arrival in Caldwell Flats had come with secondhand stories about Iron Ridge, turned out to be a genuinely exceptional hand with horses. His name was Ernesto, and he was 23, and he was terrified of Eleanor for approximately 2 weeks before he discovered that the terror was unnecessary and that there was always a covered plate if you came in late and worked hard, and after that he was fine. Harlan Briggs's bad tooth finally got dealt with in the second year, when Eleanor arranged for a dentist from Rawlings to make the long ride out specifically because she had asked and Harlan had not refused, which was as close to willing as Harlan got on medical matters. He was 44 years old and had been protecting that tooth for 3 years, and the relief when it was finally gone was so evident on his face that even he couldn't entirely hide it. "Better?" Eleanor asked when he came to the kitchen door the morning after. "Considerably," he said. He held out his coffee cup. She gave him the full measure. He didn't have to hold the cup out twice. The daughter came in the 4th year. They had not planned for her exactly, had hoped, had talked around hoping, had not said it directly because both of them had learned that saying certain things too directly was a way of giving the universe something to work with. But she arrived in November with the specific stubbornness of a child who had decided the world would have her on her own terms from the very beginning, which took 12 difficult hours, and a midwife who had clearly seen everything and was unimpressed by most of it, and who said afterward that Eleanor was the most composed woman she'd worked with, which Eleanor received as a compliment while privately knowing that composure was only possible because she'd already used up her panic in the preceding 4 months worrying about this exact situation. They named her Ruth. Gideon held her with the careful terror of a man who was not afraid of most things, and was suddenly afraid of this one specific thing, and the expression on his face when he held his daughter for the first time was the most unguarded Eleanor had ever seen him, which was very unguarded indeed. "She's so small," he said. His voice was strange. "She'll get bigger," Eleanor said. She was exhausted in a way that went past the word exhausted, but she was also underneath everything, in some place that the exhaustion couldn't quite reach, completely certain. They do. Ruth grew up at Iron Ridge. She grew up in a kitchen that smelled like ancho and wood smoke and molasses, and in a yard where there were always men working, and always something to watch, and always, eventually, someone who had time to answer a question if you asked it directly. She grew up knowing that her mother went to Cheyenne some years to talk to women's gatherings, and that this was a thing her mother did because it was important, and that important things were generally not the easiest things. She grew up knowing that her father had built something out of 40 acres and 15 cattle in a bad winter, and that building things meant you lost sleep and argued with the weather and kept going anyway. She was not a perfectly easy child. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's reserve, and some quality all her own that tended to emerge as an absolute refusal to accept other people's assessments of what she was capable of, which made her teachers intermittently frustrated and occasionally, quietly, proud. Eleanor, watching her, recognized the quality. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've carried for 30 years when you suddenly see it in another form, smaller and newer and still figuring out its own weight. She thought about the cabin with the frost on the windows. She thought about the morning Gideon had ducked under her doorframe and named a figure that made her almost drop the skillet. She thought about the drive to Iron Ridge with Cody in the wagon and the cold and the 5-minute assessment she'd given herself before she came through the door. She had not been ready. She had been terrified. She had gone anyway. That was the whole of it, really. Not the part about being strong. She'd never thought of herself as especially strong. Not the part about being chosen. She'd spent enough years unchosen to know that being chosen was not the measure of anything. The whole of it was simpler than that and harder than that. She had gone anyway. When the door was open, even the wrong door, even the scary door, even the door that everyone was betting she'd come back through in 11 days, she had gone through it. She thought about the women she'd talked to in Rawlings and Laramie and Cheyenne, and about the things she'd said that they'd repeated back to her in different words. That the world mostly moves in small shifts, and that you had to be willing to be inside the shift instead of watching from somewhere safer. She had been inside every shift, cold and uncertain and convinced at least twice that she'd made a catastrophic mistake, but inside it. On a Tuesday morning in June, always Tuesdays, she thought, Tuesdays kept being important. Eleanor came downstairs before anyone else was awake and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and looked at Iron Ridge in the early light. The repaired barn, the north paddock, the ridge line she'd walked in a January blizzard counting steps, the yard where she'd faced Vivian Harcourt with her hands loose at her sides, the kitchen table where 8 men's worth of decisions had been made over the past years. Ruth came downstairs in her nightgown, barefoot, with her hair in the state it achieved by morning that Eleanor had given up fighting some time ago. "You're up early," Eleanor said. "Couldn't sleep," Ruth said. She climbed onto the kitchen chair with the practiced ease of a child who had been doing it since before she could do it well. "Are you thinking about something?" "Several things." "About what?" Eleanor poured her a small amount of coffee, so heavily diluted, a habit she'd started when Ruth was 7, and which Ruth accepted as the closest she was going to get until she was 12, a negotiated position, and set it in front of her. "About the difference," Eleanor said, "between where I thought I was going and where I ended up." Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. She had her father's hands, broad and deliberate. "Were you scared when you came here?" "Very," Eleanor said, "but you stayed." "I stayed." Ruth thought about this with the serious face she brought to things she was actually thinking about rather than just hearing. "Because it was worth it?" Eleanor looked at her daughter, looked at the kitchen around them. Her kitchen, that she had arrived at with a crate of spice tins and a skillet and a very specific set of fears and a stubbornness that had carried her when nothing else would. "I didn't know yet if it was worth it," she said. "I stayed to find out." Ruth considered this. "That's scary." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's exactly what it is." Gideon came downstairs 20 minutes later to find them both at the kitchen table with their coffee, talking about something that made Eleanor laugh. A real laugh, the kind that was not performed and not managed, the kind she had not known how to produce for most of her adult life, and had learned here, in this kitchen, among these people, in this place that was hers. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he'd stopped in it hundreds of times now, and he looked at the two of them, and the expression on his face was the one Eleanor knew best. Not the almost smile, not the reserved assessment, but the real one, unguarded and crooked at the edge. The one that meant he was seeing something he hadn't expected the world to give him and hadn't stopped being grateful for. He poured his coffee and sat down and didn't say anything, because some things at Iron Ridge were understood without saying, and this was one of them. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what it did in June. That high clear blue, enormous and plain, over the ridge and the yard and the repaired barn and the kitchen garden, Eleanor had started in the 3rd year, and the fence line Cody had helped repair before he left, and the well that had been cleaned and relined and now ran perfectly. Iron Ridge Ranch, 40 acres and 15 cattle and a bad winter, a long time ago. Something else now. Not perfect. Nothing real was perfect. But true, built out of things that had been tested and had held, shaped by people who had stayed when leaving would have been easier, marked by every hard thing that had happened here, and by the fact that none of those hard things had been the last thing. Eleanor Blackridge sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and her daughter, and the sound of Iron Ridge waking up outside, and she thought that this was not what she would have predicted for herself at 34, standing alone in a cabin with frost on the windows and flour running low. She thought that was all right. She thought that was maybe better than all right. The world moved in small shifts. You had to be inside them. She had been inside every one.